If you're familiar with the TV show Father Ted, you'll know that it's about three priests who live essentially in exile on Craggy Island, the fictional characters, fictional series, fictional island. And one of the characters in Father Ted is somebody called Bishop Brennan. And Bishop Brennan occasionally zooms in onto Craggy Island to kind of sort out the three priests are there. He's a dour, hard-nosed, stubborn, harsh bishop. He has authority over them, and they're really quite terrified of what he thinks and what he'll say when he comes. He comes across in this terrible way. In one particular scene, he comes and he's criticizing Ted and Dougal and Jack for some sort of ethical or moral misdemeanor, and they're terrified of him. The scene shows him in his bath, in his bubble bath, and Bishop Brennan, as it pans out, you see that he's sharing his bubble bath with a very leggy brunette. He's a complete hypocrite. What he says and tells people what to do, he's not doing himself. He's kind of a figure of fun. But why it works and why people laugh on it and why it resonates with people is because for a lot of people, there's an awful lot of truth in this. That the religious leaders that they've known have said one thing but lived in a completely different way. This entire chapter of Matthew, chapter 23, sees Jesus speaking extremely strongly against a group of hypocritical religious leaders, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees, as they're called at the beginning of the chapter. Jesus uses extraordinarily strong words. Woe to you, you blind guides, you vipers, blind Pharisees, you brood of vipers. Think of the worst insult that you can think of. Pest. I know that was the worst thing you could think of. Well, when Jesus says that they're a brood of vipers and they're snakes, he's using one of the worst insults you could use for somebody in their culture. He feels so strongly about these Pharisees, about these teachers of the law and what they're doing to the people that he loves. He speaks with extraordinarily negative feeling about them. Well, it causes us to ask the question, why is Jesus getting so worked up about these religious leaders? And as we do this and we ask this question, this is not just some sort of trivial historical inquiry, but it has things that it teaches us that we can learn about what God is like. It teaches us about how God feels about us. It teaches us about how we're to please God and how we're to relate to God. It seems to me in this passage that there are broadly three complaints that Jesus has, and I want to take you through those and apply them as we go along. The first thing is that they tie up heavy loads and put burdens on people's shoulders. They do it because they don't know what it is to please God. So they put this burden on people's shoulders. Jesus says at the beginning of this that the Pharisees and the teachers of the law sit in Moses' seat. Now, what that means is that they have authority in teaching. They have responsibility for the people in the way that Moses had. Their job is to communicate to the people what God is like and what God expects of them. Now, it might be that in our culture, a religious leader is fairly peripheral and doesn't have much influence in society. But in their society at that time, these were immensely influential people. What they said and what they did carried immense authority. And what they'd done, says Jesus, is turned religion into a heavy load. They were the police of society, and people were walking around under this weight. Let me give you an example of what would happen. You see, there were rules and there were things in the Old Testament that God had given that people were supposed to do. That when we follow God, we're supposed to obey him. We don't just say we believe in God and live any way that we want. And one of the sets of rules that God gave is the Ten Commandments. They're very famous. And for example, one of those is one that says, keep the Sabbath day holy. And what that has at its heart is, it says, in the week there's 7 days, make sure to keep one of them aside, a day for rest, for not working, a day where communities gather to worship God. Keep this as part of your community life. It's a gift, says God, where you don't have to work, you get to rest from your labor. Well, what had happened was the religious leaders began to think, well, what does it mean to keep this Sabbath? What does it mean to do right? What does it mean to rest? What are we not supposed to do? What does it mean not to work? And they turned the Sabbath from a gift into a burden. They came up with a list of 39 activities that were forbidden on the Sabbath. Here they are, all 39 of them that were given by the Pharisees, forbidden for people to do on the Sabbath. Carrying, burning, extinguishing, finishing, writing, erasing, cooking, washing, sewing, tearing, knotting, untying, shaping, ploughing, planting, reaping, harvesting, threshing, winnowing, selecting, sifting, grinding, kneading, combing, spinning, dyeing, Not that kind of dyeing. Dyeing with the colours. Chain stitching, warping, weaving, unravelling, building, demolishing, trapping, shearing, slaughtering, skinning, tanning, smoothing, marking. You couldn't do any of those things. If you did those, you'd be on the moral blacklist. How could you keep these things? What am I doing? Is this work? Am I cutting here? Am I unraveling? Am I building? How do you go about your day and not do these things? They made rules and they made sure that the people kept them. Remember, if you were somebody who lived at the time, you cared because they were the gatekeepers to the God you believe in and the community that you wanted to take a full part of. It was a burden. An analogy that I can think of is the analogy of the driving license tester. You know, the person who tests you when you go for your driving license, if you've done that. Now, some people think that the best drivers are the drivers who do one test and they pass the first time. But I want you to know that the best drivers are actually the ones who are the most experienced at the test. Of course, if, like me, you were tested on multiple occasions, clearly you're a much better driver. Those tests were some of the worst experiences of my mid-20s. You're sitting there, you're driving the car, while you're simultaneously being told what to do by this tester and being judged by them. They have their checklist out, their pen in hand. Your eyes are fixed on the road, where you're going. But the whole time you're looking down and you're looking to your left because you know for a fact that there's no movement of that pen or pencil that they give that's a good thing. If their hand is moving and writing, it is a bad thing. Failed for not turning right at 90 degrees. No one ever told me that was a thing. Failed in the last corner for driving out in front of a car I hadn't seen in a wet day. One time I failed my test. I never even got into the car because my car failed the test. How am I supposed to pass the test that I can't even sit? Imagine that all of the time. Imagine the community you live in essentially has people around it with a board and a checklist saying whether you're in or whether you're out, whether you're doing the right things or not, whether you're following the law or ignoring it, whether you're failing or succeeding, watching out for your mistakes, noting down and reporting them, saying whether you can be at worship on Sunday or at the weekend because of what you've done or what you haven't done. Maybe you don't have to imagine that too hard. Maybe you're part of groups where judgmentalism exists all the time. A group where what your clothes are, what you're wearing decides whether you're in or out, whether your makeup is right or your hair is done right. Where there's a kind of a sense of judgmentalism and talking about people behind their backs, or a workplace that's gossipy about how people are or what they're like, and you're in the right. If you're in with the right people, then you're okay in the community. But if you're not, you're on the outside. There's things that you could do to embarrass yourself and mean that you get cut off. Maybe you don't have to imagine it too much in COVID times because of all the rules that have been given. I mean, I think every community has their people who are taking mental records of the houses that are not really following the rules. The people who are the curtain twitchers watching if there's unrecognizable cars outside the door, or whether they're hearing voices from the garden that are more than the two adults who are normally there, and making the old mental notes of it. When people live like this, when there's these ethical expectations and people are noting them and saying who's in and who's out, it is, says Jesus, a burden on the people. It's a heavy load of life. Secondly, then, Jesus' complaint to them is that everything they do is for the outside because they refuse to change on the inside. Everything they do is for the outside because they refuse to change on the inside. Jesus uses a whole range of a series of images from verse 25 to talk about how these religious leaders are more interested in a public outward appearance than they are about change from the inside. They're not interested in true spiritual transformation. Jesus says at verse 5, everything they do is done for people to see. That's what they're interested in. And what he does is he uses, one of the images he uses is an image from washing dishes. You clean the outside of the cup and dish, he says, but inside it's filthy. What he's saying is on the outside you're spick and span. But in the bit that's supposed to be clean, that matters most that it's clean, there's no change. There's no difference. There's no cleaning done whatsoever. It's like when you're tidying your bedroom and you're sent as a kid to tidy your bedroom, and instead of actually cleaning things and putting things away, you just stuff them all under the bed. The job's not done. You look religious as Jesus to these people on the outside. On the surface, you look like you're so holy, but your hearts, he says to them, are warped. You're hypocrites. You talk a great game, but it's not matched by actions. Another time there, he says, at verse 27, he says, you're like whitewashed tombs. You're like these beautiful graves that are white and gleaming, but inside them is just dead bones. Inside of them is nothing good at all. What a way to describe somebody's soul. You look okay on the outside, but inside you're dead. Jesus gives an example at verse 5. He says, they make their phylacteries wide and their tassels long. Describes kind of some of the religious gear that the leaders wore at the time. Tassels were things that were worn on their clothes, and the longer the tassels, the more holy you looked, or it indicated how much of an important leader you were in the religious community. This word phylactery is maybe one that you haven't used unless you play Dungeons and Dragons. I think it's a word that appears in the game Dungeons and Dragons. But otherwise, you probably never heard of this word. Well, what was it? What was it? I heard somebody describe this. They said this is what happens when someone completely fails to understand that God uses metaphors and images in the Bible. Deuteronomy 6 is a powerful passage in the Old Testament. We actually referred to it last week as part of the sermon. And there God commands his people, and he gives the broad commandment of what it is to be human. He says what it is to be alive as a person. What are you to do? And he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. To be human is to give God the highest priority in your life. But then immediately afterwards, in Deuteronomy, it gives some guidance as to what that might mean. And really what God is saying there is to live this out is to believe it, but it's also to obey what God has to say, to read what God has to say and live it out. And it says there in Deuteronomy 6, it gives metaphors about what this might look like, about what it means to listen to what God has to say, what it means to follow the Bible, and what it means to follow his commands. And it says, talk about them when you sit and when you walk and when you lie down. Then it says, tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. They're pictures of thinking at every moment, God loves me, how do I love him back? Pictures of that. Metaphors. Thinking about what it is to obey God in all circumstances. Keeping God close to your heart and your mind. Well, what had happened with these Pharisees and these teachers of the law, what do you think they had done? Well, they'd taken it literally. They'd come up with a way of actually writing the law in tiny little letters, putting it in a tiny little box, which they affixed to the top of their foreheads and wrapped around their heads. That is what a phylactery was. These people, these religious leaders, were taking this so literally, and they were walking around. And Jesus said, well, what they were doing was making the biggest ones they possibly could. So people could say, those people look ridiculous. They must be really holy and close to God. You've missed the point, says Jesus. The law and obeying God is for the heart and not for a box on the top of your head. You, religious leaders, it's all for show. But it's not just religious leaders who do this, is it? It's any of us doing things where we're just more concerned with the outside than what's on the inside. It's doing the communion, doing your communion, your first communion, your confirmation, because it's what you're supposed to do and what society does. It's going to church because it's your tradition, not your passion. It's writing sermons from a heart of knowing Sunday is coming, not because you passionately believe that it's changing people's lives and that it's the greatest privilege to share what God has to say. It's sharing your faith with people because you know it's asked of you, not because you're driven by a motivation of love for that person and a love for God. I'm not saying at all that there's not a place for doing what's right even when you don't feel like it. There's a place for having discipline and routine and making sure God is included in every part of your life, whether you feel like it or not. But we do that because it's springing from a changed heart, not because we're trying to change our heart. You can't cause a changed heart by doing these things. A changed heart might make you do them. You can't be transformed into a child of God by practicing a bit of religion. I love the picture that Jesus gives at verse 24. He says again, you're blind guides to these religious leaders. You strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. You think by doing this, but he says it's the equivalent of taking a gnat out of your soup, but all the while eating a camel. You can't do this. This outside appearance, it's nothing like what needs to be done. It's not a big enough job to change your heart. The problem of your heart is too big for your capabilities. So then Jesus' third complaint. They love to be praised by men because they don't know the praise of the one who's most praiseworthy. They love to be praised by men. If you're obsessed with what's on the outside, what ultimately is going to happen is that you're going to judge yourself by what people think of you. You're going to judge yourself by how people speak about you or respond to you. Verse 6, Jesus says, they love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to be called rabbi by others. Oh, these religious leaders love the praise of women and men. They love the approval and honor and respect of their communities. In their time, being a religious leader, because of the weight that they had, because of how much respect it got them, it was like being a VIP. They were the celebrities of the day. They were the influencers, the ones to be seen with. If they'd lived in this culture, they'd love the likes and the follows and the shares. They'd just been obsessed with getting them. Our culture is obsessed with that, with approval from people, approval from strangers, approval from our friends, needing feedback, needing to be liked, need to be seen, to be sharing something. Whether it's TikTok or whether it's Snapchat, whether it's Instagram, Twitter, whatever it is. It's Facebook if you're a little bit older. It's getting the friends, it's getting the likes. We need the approval to feel like we are somebody. Jesus says in the kingdom of God, everyone is equal, and religious leaders especially need to be careful not to exalt themselves or let themselves be exalted by the people. Don't take titles, says Jesus. Don't call people Father because you've got one Father in heaven. Let God be your teacher, your Father, and your Messiah, says God. Most of you know that I came into church. I don't have a church background at all. I didn't grow up going to a Presbyterian church or any church. One of the things that I noticed, particularly when I was first brought by friends to a Presbyterian church, and I've loved from then, is that we're a church that doesn't have hierarchy. That every member has the same say as every other member. And it's lovely. We vote for our leaders. People get to have their say in what happens. I want to give you an example of how this works in practice and how lovely I found this. We don't have hierarchy or bishops in the Presbyterian Church. But like any organizations, people do have roles and responsibilities, and they're important roles of authority. And the two of the most senior organizational roles in our church are called clerk and deputy clerk. Just believe me. Then also we have another role, and that's called a moderator. And the moderator is elected every year, and it is a place of honor, but they're elected every year and then they move on after the year. So you've got the clerk and the deputy clerk, and you've got the moderator. About 5 weeks ago, the clerk, the deputy clerk, and the moderator all came to a meeting that I initiated, that I invited each of them to. I wanted to talk about something. And what was it? Was it something important, dealing with heads of state or dealing with the government, which is a lot of what those guys do for their work? No, I wanted to talk about how to sort out some things to do with how we get Balbriggan off the ground, how we get our church there, how we get the wider church involved in supporting it all. And each of them said, no problem. They moved 90 minutes into their diary to make sure that it would happen. They came on, and for 90 minutes, they gave Balbriggan their full thought and their full prayer. And I just thought, this is great. Here's me, just a lowly local minister, and I send this email and all of them are there and they give what they have for this. That's thankfully the kind of church for the most part that we have. A humility that Jesus describes in this passage. A humility where we don't exalt one person over the other. Just humble service towards one another. That's of course not always the case, but it is what we aspire to. Well, if this passage was on Sky Sports, they'd market this encounter between Jesus and the religious leaders. Super special showdown Sunday. The new kid on the block, Jesus, versus the old guard. You can just feel the crowds loving what's going on here. The people, the leaders who've been oppressing them for years, are taking a verbal pounding from Jesus. And I can't imagine. Think of the relief of anybody who's been really hurt and burdened and weighed down and abused by somebody in authority. I don't know about the people who Harvey Weinstein who he's hurt so bad in the past. That when that came out and where people started to come on their side and believe them, the relief that they felt. And you can just imagine the relief and the burden on these people, that there's a sense of this being taken off them, the spiritual abuse that they've been feeling. You can almost feel them shouting yes with every word Jesus says to them, with every strike he makes. It's a blow struck for everyone who's ever been hurt by a religious leader, then and now, and there's so many of them. And it's so painful that religious leaders have hurt people. And you're just waiting for Jesus to finish them off, to land the killer blow with his closing words. And the crowd are baying for it, at least quietly inside themselves. If you've seen Father Ted, you'll know that one of the best bits involving Bishop Brennan is when he's about to have them exiled from Craggy Island for something they've done. Yes, I spent 11 minutes of my work time this week looking at Father Ted. And Bishop Brennan is about to kick them off the island. And what happens? They find a video. A video of a compromising situation Bishop Brennan finds themselves in. And you love it because the tables are turned. Brennan is defeated. His power is gone. We love to see this. And you're just waiting for Jesus to give the finished blow here. The finishing blow. And how does he finish? Well, he says this. He says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. That's speaking of the leaders in the temple in Jerusalem. Those who killed the prophets and stoned those who sent to you. You who don't listen to what God's prophets have to say. You who don't follow God in the right way. He says, how I long to gather your children together. As a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. Jesus finishes with tender words of lament for these religious leaders. Why does he do it? Because there's a Pharisee in every single one of us. There's a person who's tried to make their way to God by our good works, or have wandered so far from God because we felt we can't do it, or we can just do things or live by our own ways. And what Jesus is saying is, you can't do this yourself. It's straining a gnat out of your soup, but swallowing a camel. There's no one who can work their way to God. There's no one who can get there on their own. But he says, how I long to gather you. The way to God is to be gathered by him. The way to God is to surrender in the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, to allow yourself to be pulled in, because you can't do it yourself. You can't work your way to God. But God gives everything in this Messiah Jesus. He gives you what you need to be restored to him. He tells you that what it is that pleases him is for you to surrender and relent and say, yeah, you trust in Jesus. Yeah, you'll follow him. This week and for the rest of my life, I need to recognize the Pharisee in myself. My inclination to want to look good. My desire to think that I can set the rules, and if I follow them, I can please God. But what God calls me to, as he calls you to, is to allow me and you to be gathered by him, to surrender at the foot of the cross, to trust Jesus, and to let him do the transforming in you.